And across the country, cities and counties are going broke trying to keep up with public pension debt. The pension crisis was the topic of a recent Stanford University workshop.
It is this albatross around the necks of local governments and of the state government.
Stanford professor Joe Nation is talking about public employee pensions.
I think unless we do something, this system may not survive.
The biggest system in the country is right here in California, the Public Employees Retirement System, known as CalPERS. The problem is the pension fund doesn't have nearly enough money to cover the cost of current and future employee pensions. It's short, according to some estimates, by $1 trillion.
Which compares to $128 billion a year in general fund revenues. So, we're kind of 8 years of tax revenues in arrears.
Now, critics say that CalPERS has been hiding the enormity of this problem the way a gambler hides their losses, by assuming unlikely and huge returns on their investments. Now, officially, CalPERS assumes a 7% return on its investment, but economists agree that that number is closer to 3 to 4%.
What you were hearing a little bit today are folks saying that the return rate should be lower. You made the determination.
Richard Costigan sits on the CalPERS Board of Administration. Last December, they finally voted to cut the assumed return from 7.5% to 7%. But a smaller amount from investments means more has to come from governments and employees.
And this is sort of the difficulty, is if you lower the discount rate, and that's been part of the dialogue and discussion here, you push up the contribution levels of employers and employees to try to address the unfunded liability.
The bottom line, cities, counties, school districts, and ultimately taxpayers are footing a much bigger, and some say more accurate, bill.
This shows the
CalPERS estimates that about 1/3 of local and state budgets go to pay for public pensions. But experts at this recent pension workshop estimate that it's closer to 60% and growing.
Retirement spending has more than doubled in the last 5 years, and you ain't seen nothing yet.
That could bankrupt some local governments. But San Jose's former mayor, Chuck Reed, who, when he was in office, pushed hard for pension reform, says it's a bitter pill that we all have to swallow.
You got to put more money in. All of these solutions all come back, you got to put more money in.
And that appears to be the case, like it or not.
That's right. And every year we say we've got a balanced state budget, but we neglect to include
well, we
this
cut the
pension
deals.
debt.
They cut the deals with the idea of great expectations coming from the stock market, and they're far over what reality is. And they say the employer has to make up the difference. We are the employer in this.
And we don't get to negotiate those contracts. Those the politicians and city administrators who negotiate these retirement contracts.
And those city administrators wind up with those same pensions.
Public pensions in California is Stanford professor Joe Nation. Thanks so much for being here,
How are you?
Professor Nation. I'm
Sure.
doing great. I wanted to ask you, you convened this event last week at Stanford. Why?
Well, we did it because we want to make sure that people understand the basic math, because this is really basic math. In fact, I think Governor Brown called this fifth grade arithmetic. Not quite that simple, but it's simple. And we also want to emphasize the severity of the problem. This is absolutely the most challenging issue facing state and local government, not just in California, but across the country.
Now, a couple of years ago, the governor was talking about pension reform. Mayor Lee was talking about pension reform. It seemed to be everywhere. What happened there?
Well, one of the problems is that you need the legislature to lead on this, and the legislature has done anything but lead on this. I mean, they passed reform in 2014, but it really didn't do much. I think the slow economy slowed things down as well. But I think now that cities and counties and others are facing these enormous increases in their bills, what they pay, I think it's back on the front burner.
Now, can you give us an example of a couple of places that have really struggled with this?
Well, the short answer is everyone. I mean, there is no one in California that's in good shape. Everyone is seeing their contributions, what they have to pay for their employees, double over short amounts of time. And I just did a study, it's out this week in fact, that shows that it will probably at least double again in the next 10 or 15 years.
Oh my goodness. Now, there are some legal issues when it comes to changing pensions in California. Can you talk about the status of those?
Well, so there's something that people call the California rule. The California rule doesn't exist in statute. There's no reference to the California rule, but people assume today that when you start as a public employee and you're told you would get a pension, that you get that every year of your career, regardless of the condition, of the financial condition. And the Supreme Court's actually going to hear that case later this year. What happens in the private sector is if a firm or a company's in bad shape, they can say, hey, Melissa, you know what? We're not going to pay you as much as we used to. You keep what you've earned to date, but going forward, it's a different game. And that's what you have to have in the public sector, I think. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot more bankruptcies.
Now, folks who represent unions, folks at CalPERS say,
Right.
a lot of these retirees, they don't make that much. They make a small amount each month, each
Right.
year. What do you say to that?
Well, what I would say is I understand that argument, and no one's suggesting that we take away or that governments take away what you've earned to date. But again, going forward, it's got to be different. The other thing that people tend to forget, and I mean the union leadership out there, is that in the end, it's not just employers and taxpayers who will pay more, it's those retirees. CalPERS just this week added 2 more agencies, or those agencies effectively withdrew from CalPERS. In one case, they're going to cut pensions 80%. Imagine if you're a pensioner and you were getting, say, $5,000 a month, now you're going to get $1,000. So in the end, the people who will really get hurt are the retirees and the employees. And so we need to see more leadership, I think, from unions and public employees.
And where's that going to come from? What's going to force it? You think maybe with another doubling of the obligation, people might really start feeling this crunch?
Well, I think they will, and I think once they understand the true magnitude of this. I mean, we I have a website called pensiontracker.org, and if you go there, we've estimated that the total unfunded liability or pension debt, money we don't have, is over $1 trillion. $1 trillion for the state of California, and that's in a state, we spend about $125 billion a year at the state level. So 8 state budgets just to take care of the debt.
My goodness. Well, I'll be watching for that lawsuit to be heard this fall by the state Supreme Court, and maybe that can provide a path forward for some of these local governments and the state government. But thank you so much for being here, Joe Nation.